The basement smelled of mold and forgotten things. Her flashlight beam cut through absolute darkness, revealing a space that had once been used for storage. Metal shelving units stood empty. Cardboard boxes had collapsed into soggy piles. The concrete floor was covered with puddles from decades of water seeping through the foundation. But there was a door at the far end, slightly ajar, that led to stairs going up. Emma climbed carefully, testing each step before putting her full weight on wood that creaked and groaned under even her slight frame. At the top, she emerged into a hallway that still showed traces of its original purpose. Faded educational posters clung to water-stained walls. Broken ceiling tiles revealed pipes and wiring. Classroom doors stood open, revealing spaces frozen in time. She moved through the first floor systematically, checking each room. Old desks remained in some classrooms, covered with dust and the dried remains of what might have been ceiling leaks. A teacher's lounge held a coffee maker that looked like it belonged in a museum. The library was the most haunting space, empty shelves stretching wall to wall, a few forgotten books scattered on the floor like casualties of retreat. But it was on the second floor that Emma found the principal's office, and inside that office, filing cabinets that made her heart race. The cabinets were old but substantial. 4 tall metal units, locked, but the locks were as degraded as everything else in the building. Emma used a letter opener from the desk to work the first lock until it clicked open. Inside were student records. Thousands of them. Names she didn't recognize from decades before she was born. But as she searched through the files, she began to understand the bureaucratic architecture of how children moved through systems. Enrollment forms, transfer documents, custody authorizations, records of where students went when circumstances changed. She was looking at a blueprint for how the system worked. In the second cabinet, she found something more recent. Records from the final years before the school closed, including documentation of students from the children's home who had been enrolled here. And among those files, she discovered transfer records showing children being moved to private educational placements and specialized agricultural programs with addresses in 3 different states. Children from Riverside County Children's Home, the same institution where Emma now lived, all transferred to suspicious locations during the tenure of Barbara Whitmore. Emma photographed everything with an old digital camera she'd found in one of the classrooms, its battery miraculously still holding a charge. She worked methodically, documenting names, dates, and destinations. Evidence that could prove a pattern. Proof that what happened to Tommy Meyer wasn't an isolated incident. She was so focused on the files that she almost missed the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. Emma froze, her flashlight beam going still against the filing cabinet. The footsteps weren't trying to be quiet. They moved with the confidence of someone who belonged, or someone who didn't care if they were heard. "I know someone's in here," a male voice called out. "Building's not safe. You need to leave before you get hurt." It wasn't Director Whitmore's voice. Emma recognized it as belonging to Frank Morrison, the maintenance supervisor from the children's home. A man with cold eyes who enforced the director's rules with quiet threats and strategic cruelty. Emma's mind raced through options. The office had only one door. The windows were 3 stories above solid concrete. If Morrison found her with the files, everything she'd discovered would disappear. That's when she noticed something she'd missed in her initial search of the office. Behind a bookshelf that had been pushed slightly away from the wall, there was a door. Small, painted the same color as the wall, nearly invisible until you looked directly at it. A service door, probably built to allow maintenance access between rooms without using the main hallways. Emma grabbed the camera and moved to the door as quietly as possible. It wasn't locked. Behind it was a narrow passage, barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through, with wooden stairs leading both up and down into darkness. She stepped inside and pulled the door closed just as Morrison entered the principal's office. In the absolute darkness of the hidden passage, Emma held her breath and listened as Morrison searched the office. She heard filing cabinets being opened and closed, heard papers being shuffled, heard his frustrated curse when he found the camera she'd been using still sitting on the desk. "Damn kids," Morrison muttered. Then his footsteps moved away, taking the camera with him. Emma waited in the darkness for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. When she finally opened the door again, the office was empty. Morrison had taken the camera but apparently hadn't noticed the small service door. She had lost her evidence. But she had something potentially more valuable. She had found a hidden passage that Morrison didn't know existed. And if this building held secrets worth protecting, this passage might lead to them. Emma made a decision that changed everything. Instead of leaving the school and returning to the children's home before she was missed, she began to explore the hidden passages. The narrow staircase led up to the third floor, emerging in what had once been a storage area behind the old auditorium. From there, the passage split into multiple directions, creating a network of maintenance corridors that ran through the entire building like veins in a body. These weren't just simple utility spaces. They were deliberately complex, designed to allow staff to move through the building without being seen. Probably built during an era when such passages were common in large institutional buildings. Emma followed one branch that led behind what had been the school gymnasium. The passage here widened slightly, and someone had clearly used it recently. There were footprints in the dust. Fresh scratches on the walls where something large had been moved through. At the end of this passage was another door, this one modern and solid, with a heavy lock that looked far newer than anything else in the building. But the lock had been left open. Emma pushed the door carefully, and what she saw beyond made her breath catch in her throat. Was a room. A large room that took up space where the school's old equipment storage should have been. But it wasn't abandoned. It was being actively used. The space was filled with filing cabinets, computers, office equipment, and stacks of documents that looked nothing like old school records. This was a functioning office hidden inside an abandoned building. And from what Emma could see in the dim light filtering through cracks in the boarded windows, the documents were all related to children. Transfer forms, custody agreements, financial records showing payments received, correspondence with organizations in multiple states, lists of names with ages, physical descriptions, and notes about work capacity and behavioral compliance. Emma's hands trembled as she began photographing with the backup disposable camera she brought as a precaution. This wasn't just evidence. This was the entire operation. The complete documentation of how Barbara Whitmore had been trafficking children for years, hidden in a building everyone assumed was empty and forgotten. She worked quickly, photographing every document she could reach. Names of children, dates of transfers, amounts of money received, addresses of facilities where children had been sent, communications discussing products and inventory and units in language that made her sick to understand. This was bigger than she'd imagined. This wasn't just Riverside County Children's Home. This was a network involving multiple institutions, multiple states, possibly dozens of children sold into situations that ranged from illegal labor to circumstances Emma's mind refused to fully contemplate. She was so focused on documenting everything that she didn't hear the door behind her open until it was too late. "Well," Barbara Whitmore's voice said from the doorway, "I had wondered how long it would take for one of you to cause real problems." Emma spun around, the camera clutched against her chest. Director Whitmore stood in the doorway with Frank Morrison behind her. But Whitmore didn't look angry. She looked calm, almost satisfied. "You're a clever girl, Emma," the director continued. "Much cleverer than most. But you've made a mistake that can't be undone." Morrison moved to take the camera, but Emma backed away, her mind racing for any possible escape. The room had no other exits. The windows were 3 stories up and boarded solid. She was trapped with the 2 people who had been selling children and who now had every reason to make sure she could never tell anyone what she'd discovered. "The problem you see," Whitmore said in that same terrifyingly calm voice, "is that you've seen too much. You know too much. And I've worked too hard building this operation to let one curious child destroy everything." Emma's back hit the wall. She had nowhere left to go. Morrison reached for the camera, and she knew that once he took it, the evidence would disappear. And probably she would too. That's when the door burst open with a force that sent Morrison stumbling. 3 people entered the room. 2 wore FBI raid jackets. The third was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and fierce eyes that swept the scene with professional assessment. "Barbara Whitmore," the woman said, "you're under arrest for human trafficking, child endangerment, fraud, and about 30 other charges we'll add as we go through this office." What Emma didn't know, couldn't have known, was that she wasn't the first person to discover the hidden office. She wasn't even the first child. 6 months earlier, a boy named Michael Chen had found the office during his own attempt to document abuse at the children's home. But Michael had been caught before he could tell anyone what he'd seen. He'd been transferred immediately to a facility in Nevada, where he'd been placed in such restricted conditions that he couldn't communicate with the outside world. But Michael had managed to hide a single piece of evidence before his transfer. A photograph of financial documents he'd tucked into a library book that he left on a shelf in the old school, with a note that simply read, "Tell someone who matters." 3 months later, a volunteer librarian organizing donated books for a rural literacy program found that photograph and note. She brought it to a friend who worked for a child advocacy organization. That organization brought it to the FBI. And for 3 months, federal agents had been building a case against Barbara Whitmore while quietly documenting every child transfer, every financial transaction, every piece of evidence that showed systematic trafficking. They'd been planning to raid the children's home the following week. But when their monitoring equipment picked up Emma's break-in to the abandoned school, they'd accelerated their timeline, turning her discovery into the moment that broke the case wide open. The woman with the fierce eyes was Special Agent Patricia Hammond, head of the FBI's Crimes Against Children Unit for the Pacific Northwest. She'd been pursuing Barbara Whitmore for 2 years after noticing patterns in child disappearances from rural Oregon institutions. Emma Mitchell, Agent Hammond said after Morrison and Whitmore had been handcuffed and led away. "You're either the bravest or the most foolish 12-year-old I've ever met. Probably both." Emma couldn't speak. The adrenaline that had kept her moving was draining away, leaving her shaking and cold. She held out the disposable camera with trembling hands. "I have pictures," she managed to say, "of everything." Agent Hammond took the camera carefully, then did something Emma didn't expect. She crouched down so they were eye to eye. "You did good, kid," she said quietly. "You did what most adults wouldn't have the courage to do. You're going to help us save a lot of children." Over the following days, Emma learned the full scope of what her discovery had helped expose. Barbara Whitmore had been trafficking children for 9 years. She'd created a sophisticated network that moved vulnerable children from institutions in 3 states to locations where they were exploited for labor, kept in conditions that violated every standard of care, and prevented from communicating with anyone who might help them. 47 children were recovered from various facilities during the coordinated raids that followed Emma's discovery. Some had been missing for years. Others had been transferred so recently they still remembered their friends from institutions they'd been taken from. Tommy Meyer was found at a farm in eastern Oregon where he'd been working 16-hour days with 5 other children, all under the age of 14. He was malnourished and traumatized but alive. When Emma was reunited with him in a supervised facility where recovered children were being cared for, he hugged her and cried and said the same thing over and over. "You came back. You didn't forget me." The old school became a crime scene, processed by forensic teams who spent weeks documenting every record in the hidden office. The evidence recovered led to arrests of 12 additional people involved in the trafficking network, including officials at other institutions, facilitators who arranged transports, and operators of facilities where children had been held. The case made national news. Not because of Emma's name, which was kept confidential because of her age, but because of the scope of the operation and the failure of oversight systems that had allowed it to continue for nearly a decade. Emma was placed with an emergency foster family while permanent arrangements were determined. The family, Dan and Carol Richardson, were experienced foster parents who specialized in caring for children from traumatic situations. Their home was warm and safe and filled with a kind of ordinary kindness that Emma had almost forgotten existed. She had her own room, clean clothes, regular meals, adults who asked how she was feeling and actually listened to the answer. But the trauma didn't vanish overnight. Emma had nightmares about the hidden office, about Morrison's footsteps, about what would have happened if the FBI hadn't been monitoring the building. She struggled with survivor's guilt knowing she'd escaped while children like Tommy had been sold. She had trouble trusting adults even when they showed her nothing but kindness. Carol Richardson, who had a background in trauma counseling, helped her understand that healing wasn't about forgetting what happened. It was about integrating the experience into a life that could move forward. "You were dealt an impossible situation," Carol said during one of their late-night conversations. "And you made choices that saved lives. That's not something to feel guilty about. That's something to build on." 6 months after the raids, Emma testified at Barbara Whitmore's trial. She was prepared for weeks by victim advocates and prosecutors who made sure she understood the process and felt safe every step of the way. When she finally sat in the witness box and looked across the courtroom at the woman who had sold children like merchandise, Emma didn't feel scared. She felt clear. She told the truth. Simply, directly, without embellishment. She described what she'd overheard, what she'd found, why she believed she had to act. The defense attorney tried to frame her as a troubled child with a history of behavioral problems who had invented a dramatic story. But the evidence from the hidden office, corroborated by 47 rescued children and hundreds of documents, made that defense impossible. Barbara Whitmore was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. Frank Morrison received 35 years. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 10 to 40 years depending on their level of involvement. But the real victory, Agent Hammond told Emma after the trial, wasn't the prison terms. Was the reform. The case led to federal legislation requiring quarterly inspections of all residential facilities for children, creating mandatory reporting systems that couldn't be circumvented by local authorities, and establishing independent advocacy programs where children could confidentially report abuse without fear of retaliation. Emma's actions had exposed not just one criminal operation but systemic failures that had allowed such operations to exist. The reforms that followed would protect children she would never meet in facilities she would never see. She was 13 when the Richardsons officially adopted her. The paperwork was straightforward since she had no living relatives to contest the placement, and by that point she'd been with them long enough to know this was where she wanted to be. "You're stuck with us now," Dan Richardson said with a smile when they told her the adoption was final. "For better or worse." "Mostly better, I hope." Emma returned to regular school for the first time in 2 years. It was strange at first, being around kids her own age who complained about homework and argued about sports teams and had normal problems that didn't involve survival. But gradually, she began to relax into a life that felt almost ordinary. She stayed in touch with Tommy Meyer, who had been adopted by a family in Portland and was receiving therapy to process his trauma. They wrote letters and occasionally video called, two survivors who understood each other in ways that words couldn't fully capture. She also maintained a connection with some of the other children who'd been rescued. A support group had been formed for trafficking survivors, and though Emma didn't attend every session, she went often enough to feel part of a community who understood what she'd been through. Agent Hammond visited periodically, checking in on Emma's progress and updating her on how the reforms were being implemented. She'd become something of an unofficial mentor, showing Emma that strength wasn't about never being afraid. It was about acting despite fear. "You know," Hammond said during one visit when Emma was 14, "the FBI has a program for people interested in careers fighting crimes against children. Might be something to think about when you're older." Emma smiled. She'd been thinking about it already. By the time she was 16, Emma had become a youth advocate, speaking at conferences about child welfare reform. She didn't tell her full story publicly, but she shared enough to make clear that children in institutions needed voices, needed oversight, needed adults who would listen when they said something was wrong. She also excelled academically, discovering a passion for law and social justice that shaped her long-term plans. The Richardsons supported her ambitions while making sure she stayed grounded in a teenage life that included friends and hobbies and all the ordinary growth that traumatized children deserved. On her 17th birthday, Carol Richardson gave her a gift that made Emma cry. It was a framed photograph of the old Riverside School, taken just before demolition crews tore it down. The building was gone now, replaced by a community center dedicated to child advocacy and support services. "That building held terrible secrets," Carol said, "but it also held your courage. Remember both." Emma kept that photograph on her desk through high school and into college, where she studied criminal justice and child welfare policy. She graduated with honors, went to law school, and eventually joined the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit where Agent Hammond had paved the way decades earlier. By the time she was 30, Special Agent Emma Mitchell Richardson had built a career around protecting vulnerable children. She led investigations that dismantled trafficking networks. She trained other agents in recognizing patterns of institutional abuse. She testified before Congress about strengthening child protection systems. But she never forgot where she started. She never forgot the feeling of being 12 years old and utterly alone except for her own determination to do what was right. She never forgot Tommy Meyer and the 46 other children whose lives had been stolen and then reclaimed. She never forgot that sometimes courage looks like a frightened child breaking into an abandoned building because no adult was brave enough to listen. And she never stopped fighting for children who reminded her of the girl she'd been, the one who discovered that even when the world seems designed to protect predators and ignore victims, one person willing to act can change everything. The old Riverside School was gone, demolished and rebuilt as something that honored children instead of hiding crimes against them. The children's home was closed, its buildings repurposed for community services that actually served the community. But Emma's legacy continued in every child who found safety because systems had been reformed. In every trafficking victim who was rescued because agents had been trained better. In every vulnerable kid who spoke up because they'd learned that sometimes, rarely but sometimes, adults actually listen. The door Emma had found in an abandoned school had led to more than evidence. It had led to a life dedicated to making sure no child ever again faced what she'd faced. No child sold. No child forgotten. No child left to fight alone. That was the real discovery behind the hidden door. Not the operations documents or the trafficker's guilt, but the understanding that justice isn't something that happens to people. It's something people create through choices that cost them safety and peace but gain them something more valuable. The knowledge that they stood up when it mattered. That they protected others when protection was desperately needed. That they transformed their own suffering into shields for children who came after them. Emma Mitchell Richardson had found a hidden door in an abandoned school when she was 12 years old. Behind it, she discovered evidence that saved dozens of lives. But she'd also discovered something deeper. She discovered who she was capable of becoming when everything was on the line and no one else was coming to help. That discovery had shaped the rest of her life. And through her work, it would shape the lives of thousands of children she would never meet, who would grow up safer because a frightened 12-year-old girl had decided that some things were worth risking everything to expose. The hidden door was gone now. The school was gone. But what Emma found there, the courage and conviction and refusal to let injustice remain hidden, those things endured. Those things became the foundation of a life spent in service of the most vulnerable. Those things made all the difference.